Okay, we're going to start off this video by taking a look at the determinants of economic exposure or operating exposure. And the first thing we'll notice is that there's the structure of the market's affected. So the nature of your inputs and where you sell are going to both be determinants. So if your inputs are in a different country, that could expose you to this economic exposure, this notion that exchange rates changing can kind of mess up your cost structure, cause your costs to go up or down actually, and that'll affect you. So to the extent that your labor or materials, your inputs are coming from overseas or that sort of thing. And then what affects the response to currency changes? Well, price elasticity is a really big one. And this is a notion that you should have had already, but we'll just reiterate it real quick. Elasticity of demand is the notion that there's a very small change in price means that there's a relatively large change in demand. That would be highly elastic if small changes in price mean large changes in demand. And then inelastic means that you could have a large change in price, but that would mean a relatively small change in demand. And so kind of the classic examples of elasticity of demand or things that have highly elastic demand would be things like sugar, right? A commodity, one person's sugar is no different from another person's sugar. And so if somebody's charging you a nickel less a pound, you're gonna buy their sugar. Whereas with inelastic demand, things that are there's no good substitutes for. So if it's a very specific drug that you need, you're going to be willing to pay anything. Certainly if you have insurance, you'll be willing to pay anything you can to get that drug because you've got to have that. Or another example of inelastic demand would be things that have very particular brand names, right? Very strong brand names, very strong brand images. So you might be willing to pay much more money than you would otherwise for a similar product because of the brand name. So you might think of Apple iPhones, that kind of thing, where people are paying $1,000 for a smartphone when they could probably get a comparable smartphone for half that price or less, but because of the brand name of Apple, they want to pay a lot more. So Apple would be one of those things that has, because of its brand name, would have relatively inelastic demand. All right, what kind of things affect elasticity? We just talked about this, how close of a substitute there is, the brand name, the quality of the goods, etc. So if you had, for instance, oh goodness, what would be a good example? Oh yeah, just like Coke, Coca-Cola, and then you have the kind of the fake stuff that grocery stores might put out as a cola substitute. In my own personal taste, Coca-Cola is much higher quality, and so I would be willing to pay much more for a Coca-Cola than for the Safeway brand of carbonated beverage that has a kind of a syrupy mocha color to it. All right, and then let's talk as we wrap up this set of videos with managing operating exposure. We have several different things we can do. One would be to select low-cost production sites. So we might, or Japan, if they're selling cars in the U.S., they might start manufacturing in the U.S. to guard against yen appreciation, right? So to the extent that they can kind of shift production, they're no longer exposed to yen costs going up and down on the cost side of things. If they can put everything in the U.S., the sales and the costs, now they've kind of built a natural hedge, and the only thing that they're exposed to is the profits that they're repatriating, and that was the very first example we looked at. So, and this further example, they might even get a few different sites and shift production as exchange rates change. So maybe they have a Mexico production facility and a Canadian production facility in the U.S. So they got North America covered, and to the extent that labor relations allow it, maybe they can shift production to the area that has the most advantageous currency kind of things going on at that particular point in time. Not really likely, but that would be a kind of a longer term solution. They could shift production. A second possible way of managing operating exposure is to use flexible sourcing. So this is where you'd source your inputs where the costs are low. Supply chains have been in the news a lot lately, and this would be a very big supply chain kind of a question. So you'd kind of go out and find inputs, producers of goods that you need, and source several different firms, and then kind of give the most business to where those costs were low. If the dollar is strong or is appreciating, U.S. firms could source goods from foreign suppliers to hold costs down instead of producing them domestically. Diversify the market. So if a firm is selling in a variety of foreign markets that have different currency regimes, And if those currencies aren't highly correlated, then a firm might be well diversified from an exchange rate standpoint. All right, so if the dollar is appreciating versus the yen, but at the same time it's depreciating versus the euro, you kind of have this natural hedge built in because you're selling in a variety of markets. Of course, if the dollar is universally appreciating because of some kind of global economic catastrophe, then maybe you're screwed no matter what. R&D efforts or product differentiation. To the extent that you have kind of superior technology, superior products, then you're going to have less elasticity of demand. You might be better able to pass through the costs or raise the prices. We looked at those examples earlier. So again, if you have something that's clearly superior in terms of its quality and your costs go up because of exchange rates, it's likely or more likely that you can raise your prices to offset that impact. Number 5 here, high quality goods that are differentiated from competitors can help mitigate operating exposure. So an example, certainly classic example, would be Japanese cars versus US cars. I think US cars have been maybe closing the quality gap in the past decade or so, but not well. Japanese, I think, cars still have a competitive advantage in terms of quality, and that was certainly true 10, 20, 30 years ago. They were clearly better cars, and so people would be willing to pay more for them, even if the cost were higher. And then lastly, financial hedging. This is what we've talked about in a number of chapters to this point. We could hedge the expected profit. We could use futures. We could use forwards. We could use options. All of these to manage the exposure that we have to our cash flows as a firm because of exchange rate fluctuations. So that's going to wrap up this video. We're going to take a look at how to measure economic exposure. Let me find that document here. Here we go. We're going to start with the next video by looking at this, how to measure economic exposure. And there's a way. Basically, it's a little regression, and we look at a beta coefficient, and it will be our exposure coefficient. So we'll pick up in the next video by looking at how to measure economic exposure, and I'll see you then.